Okay, maybe we should start.
Yeah.
I think all the people that want to listen to English are here, so that's fine. So, I'll stand up. This is a training I originally did at Target. Changed it a little bit, but basically it's a case study of something that went wrong with our front-end code quality and some of the problems that it caused. And then it's what we did about it and what some of the lessons are for best practices for front-end code quality. I think we have some new people that are new to Target as well that haven't seen it either, so that should be useful. So I'm going to start by just going through a case study of what happened. Really quickly, for those that don't know, Target is a flooring company. They're like the world's second biggest flooring company, I think. And the Target team, Theodo, I think it's one of the biggest teams at Theodo. It's like 3 or 4 teams all working on the same code base. And it's been going for a bit more than 2 years, so it's quite a big code base with the potential for code debt, and we have to always think about how we can improve that. I'm going to be talking specifically about part of the site, a kind of product called a configurable product. So what it is, it's a kind of floor where you can choose your own texture, your own color, a few other options, and then you can order the sample based on how you've configured it. Which is a bit different to most products where you just order them and they are what they are. This is what it looks like. This is an example. You click choose a texture and you choose a texture. You click choose a color and you choose a color. You get the idea. It appears like that. And once you've chosen all of those things, there's this order sample button where you can actually order your sample. So this was the component that we had some code quality issues with, and we're going to see what we can learn from it. So this is a Vue.js component. I think most people deal with React. We don't seem to use Vue.js for much else in Theodo, but it's pretty much the same. A Vue component and a React component work pretty much the same way. This component has a method, order sample, and what you see on the right is it just creating a big object, which is a sample. That's all you need to know. Don't worry too much about what all of these different properties are. It's a sample object that means the user can order a sample. The second component you need to know about is the image component. So when you're choosing an option, there's an image of the different options. That's in a image component. It's a Vue component, just like a React component. It needs to be in a component because there's a bit of logic for figuring out which image you should be showing to the user. And on mobile, when you click to order a sample, you get taken to this other page where you see the image again, but this time it has an order sample button again. So that's in the image component. So this is the product image component. It also has a method, add configurable sample for mobile. And if you look at it, it's creating the sample object again. So you probably can see it looks exactly the same as the method in its grandparent, the container component. So you can create a sample here, but strangely, you can also create a sample in the image component, and it's done in exactly the same way. So there's some code duplication and maybe some methods that are not where they should be, and we're going to try and talk about why that might be and what we can do to prevent it. Also, in the image component, because we're creating this sample in a component that's just for showing an image, we have to have lots of props that we pass down that are specific to making a sample. So this is supposed to be a component for showing an image, but it has lots of props that have nothing to do with showing an image. The props are to do with creating a sample, which probably isn't something that an image component should actually be doing. Sample ID, ERP system, basket, these are things that we shouldn't really need to know about if we're an image component. Also, there's this mixin. So in Vue.js, a mixin is basically just a component, and you can include it in another component. When you do that, it inherits all of the methods and the props and the data of that mixin. So it's a bit like in React, just having a component extend another component. It's the same sort of thing. And what you can see is the configurable product, the root component, has this category mixin. That mixin is included in another mixin, which is included in the product image. So we have lots and lots of methods being included in different places that are now duplicated, and it's quite a complex, confusing architecture.
Do you have a scheme with the architecture? What are variants? What are the child?
No, but there's this.
This is quite a... Okay.
It's quite confusing, but don't worry because we'll fix it. So, structuring a front-end component. Some of the problems. A component for displaying a square image creates an orderable sample object. That's a strange thing for it to do. You wouldn't think that an image component would have to worry about something like that. The configurable root component and its grandchild image style both inherit the same mixin. They have the same method, so a root component and the child that it contains within another child have a lot of the same methods, which is a bit strange, probably not necessary. The configurable, the root component and its grandchild both create an identical sample object, and it's a lot of logic and it's a big object. The image style component inherit the add to cart mixin, which I didn't show you, but it has a method for doing network calls, which have side effects and can make it harder to test. It's a bit of a strange thing to do. And most of the image styles props are only used for creating this sample object. They're not used for showing an image. It has props that it shouldn't have, data that it doesn't need. So, some best practice is really simple. A component should be as stateless as possible. If you can avoid giving it a state and data besides giving it some props, you should do that. Closely connected to that, it should be as functional as possible. So with the same inputs, you should always get the same output. Making it stateless makes it easier to do that. But if you can make it as functional as possible and as stateless as possible, that's better. And reusable, one of the main points of Vue.js and React is to make reusable components, like user interface components. This image tile that we saw, the image component, can't be reused anywhere else because it requires props specific to creating this sample, so we can't use it elsewhere, which is the main point of having React and Vue.js to an extent. So there are two kinds of components. I think there's UI components and container components, and you should try and be disciplined about which is which and make sure that they meet the standard for what counts as each. So a UI component is something that the user can look at on the page. It corresponds to an actual thing. And it should ideally have no data object, only props. In React, that would be no state. So it shouldn't be doing set state. It shouldn't have a state that it sets in its constructor. In Vue.js, it's called a data property. It's the same thing. It shouldn't have it. Its props should all be used in its template, and they should be necessary for display. So ideally, you wouldn't have any props like we saw that aren't used in the template and therefore actually useful for displaying it. Or its props should be used in methods for formatting, which are then used for display. That's okay if you need to, for example, format a currency or something like that. And if it encapsulates a data mutation event, like there's a button that you click that changes something, it should be given a callback props. It shouldn't do the logic itself. It should get a callback that's defined somewhere more sensible, and it doesn't know what it does, it just calls it. All it needs to know is that when someone clicks me, I do this thing, and I don't know what it is. Yeah. If it doesn't correspond to UI element, like it's the root container that contains all of the UI elements but isn't actually corresponding to something visible on the page directly, then it's a little different. It should contain all the data or get it in props via the store. So if you have Redux set up or in Vue.js Vuex, that's even better. But the point is to have the data in the sort of the root, whether that's the store or a component that contains everything else. The data should be in one place. It should contain all the logic for mutating that data. So you should be able to pass that method as a callback to a child, but it should be defined in the container that has the data. So data and methods for changing data are all in the same place. Pass methods to children as callback props, and deal with network calls and things that have side effects. Again, ideally you could use something like Sagas or some tool that allows you to actually take it outside of that component too. But if you have network calls and side effects, they should be kind of kept separate from UI components and put in some route somewhere that's more sensible. So what are the benefits? The main one is creating a shared UI library. So if UI components don't have any logic for mutating data, they can be reused anywhere. If they take callback props that they don't know what they are, you could give it any callback and it can be used anywhere, and you can start saving yourself a lot of time when you're building the front end. Application logic are all in one place, the container component. And it makes most components a lot more easy to test if they're stateless and functional. So given the same inputs, you always get the same output. You'll find that testing is much easier and there's less mocking to do if you do this. I think it's similar to the kind of model view controller pattern. It's the same when you're architecting a front-end structure. So your views are the UI components, and your controller is this root container component that has all of the logic. And your model would ideally be separate again, so the store or the Vuex store. But if you don't have that set up, it's okay to put it in some kind of root container. So separating MVC is really important on the back end. It's important on the front end too, and you can do it by keeping this kind of thing in mind. So, what's the solution to the problem that we had? What you can see first is that most things I've stripped out of product image. All that stuff is now gone. It doesn't need to have a method for creating a sample. It doesn't need to have a mix-in. And all of those props, we can get rid of almost all of them. Instead, we give it a prop click handler, and we pass it the method that's defined in the container component. So it's only defined in one place, and it's just passed to the UI component and used. Really simple. The generate sample method creates a sample object for mobile and desktop, and it's defined in the root. Auto sample callback passed when we talked about that. So, what are some things that we can learn from this more generally? I think one thing that's useful is using kind of structural tools from day one. So at Target, we introduced Vue.js gradually. One of the reasons we used Vue rather than React is because I think there's no JSX, and it's a bit easier to include it in twig templates that we use with PHP and things like that, and introduce it gradually. So we didn't really start using the Vuex store. We use it a little bit now, but I think if you use a store, it forces you to put your data in the kind of root and takes it out of all of your components, which begins to force you to start moving methods into more sensible places and things like that. So even if you're introducing these things gradually to a bigger project, I think it's worth using the store as soon as possible, or tools like this. Another thing, dealing with asynchronous calls, you can use Redux Saga for taking side effect methods out of the component entirely, so that all of your components, even the ones that do network calls, are stateless, pure kind of functions. In Vue, we don't really have sagas, from what I can tell. There are a few wrappers, so I'm not quite sure what you can do in Vue. One thing is the container pattern. So you have a root container that does all of your network calls, and all of the calls are just in one container, and it's separate even from your container components that have the logic for dealing with data. Another thing you can do is make methods stateless pure functions. So remember on the right, the method for creating a sample, it references this all the time. It says this dot da 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 and sets it. On the left is a refactored version of it that takes lots of arguments. So there's no referencing of the state. Everything is passed in as an argument. I think it's a good practice because, one, it makes it easier to refactor. If you want to move something somewhere else, you just give it different arguments. You don't need to refactor all the different this references. And the other reason is that it makes testing a lot easier. So rather than having to mock the entire component and mock all of the different interactions that set the state, you can just do something like this where you call the method and give it the input you want and then expect the output you want. And it's a lot easier to do. Another thing, how do you communicate between children and parents? This is a Vue.js example. So it's quite simple. The child displays a number and it has a button. The button, when you click it, increments the number. It's quite simple. The data is contained in the parent, and the method for updating the data is in the parent. One thing that's different with Vue.js than React is events. So with React, you would usually pass a callback prop to the child to update this number. Here what you can see instead is there's this event count update in the child, and then it triggers the update displayed number method in the parent. And you can see in the child there's this this.emit that emits the event. It's a Vue.js specific way of communicating from a child to a parent. I think one of the problems with doing it that way is this. It encourages people to put logic in the child rather than the parent. So in this case, in the child we actually do the increment of the number and then we emit that event once it's done. Whereas it should be done in the parent. So this is better. The parent does all the logic and the child just emits an event and doesn't do anything else. But I think it's even better to use callbacks, because when you do that, the child doesn't have any methods at all. So the child now doesn't have any methods, it just takes the parent's method as a callback prop. And what that means is that nobody is tempted to put logic in the child, because there's no logic in the child anyway. It's impossible to do. Which means that if you have a new developer that hasn't done React or Vue.js before, they're not tempted to put things in the wrong place. So that's another thing that you can do. Cool. So that's it. Quite simple. Any questions from anybody? No. Okay, cool. All right. Thanks.